I love history. I love reading about how the lives of people and the choices that they made affected their world and even ours today. And that is so true when I think of how seemingly random and unrelated people and events came together to bring about the rebirth of the ancient homeland for the Jewish people, the modern state of Israel. Welcome to Israel Unveiled. My name is Sandy Wezowicz, and I'm the Israel Education Director for Aglow International, a ministry with established groups in more than 150 nations of the world. I love history. I love reading about how the lives of people and the choices that they made affected their world and even ours today. And that is so true when I think of how seemingly random and unrelated people and events came together to bring about the rebirth of the ancient homeland for the Jewish people, the modern state of Israel. Some people think that the nation of Israel came about in 1948 through the UN partition plan of the area that was known as Palestine. But the truth is, it had its beginnings 60 years before that. And so what I want to do in this podcast is to share what I've seen as three things or three strands of events that happened in the 1880s that merged together to bring about this momentous historical change in the birth of the state of Israel. And the first movement, is a movement of the Jewish people back to their ancient homeland. It was in the 1880s that there was an increase of the violent persecutions or pogroms that were taking place against the Jewish people in Russia, where they had been experiencing prejudice and persecution. And the Jews, for the most part, lived in poverty, and they lived in restricted areas designated by the Russian authorities, and they were called the Pale of Settlement, and that would not end until 1917. They were often overcrowded. They were places of limited economic opportunities that led, of course, to poverty, and they were socially isolated from the rest of Russia. And they faced discriminatory laws and cycles of violence. And sadly, it was at this time that they were partly fueled by the Russian Orthodox Church, especially during Holy Week. And you see, passions would increase against the Jews because the Jews in the story of Holy Week were the ones who crucified Jesus. And so the people would take to the streets. And it was a dangerous time for the Jewish people. In this cyclical persecution, there were Jews who began to realize that assimilation and acceptance would never happen in Russia. And at that time, in 1882, there were a group of 14 young Russian Jews who decided they were going to go to Palestine. And Palestine at that time was still under the Ottoman Turks. They weren't motivated, by the way, by religious fervor. They weren't religious Jews who wanted to be able to practice their Judaism without being persecuted. No, what they wanted to do was, because of the persecution and all that was happening to the Jewish people, they wanted to go back to their ancient homeland. They wanted to return to it and to reestablish it as a place of safety and as a place of refuge for the Jews. They were idealistic, young people. Actually, the oldest was only 20 years old. And like most young people, they had more zeal than practical skills to survive. And believe me, I've read their story. They barely did survive. But 2 years later, there would be another group that were thankfully better prepared to work the soil, and they came to the southern Judea hills, and they established a settlement, and they named it Gadara, and it still exists today. A lovely area. So the return of the Jewish people back to their ancient homeland had begun. And so rather than those starry-eyed young intellectuals, the pioneers that would then follow were better prepared for the harsh life that was required in order to sustain life in Israel in Palestine at that time. So they came and they were expecting to work hard, and they came with the goal of establishing self-supporting agricultural communities, and that is what is called the kibbutz system. And the first that was established as a permanent settlement was Degania, and it became the first of the kibbutz system, and it would be followed by many others. So Aliyah, which by the way means to go up, and if you go to Israel and you go to Jerusalem, you will go up. You'll arrive and you'll look up and you will see Jerusalem, on the hills of Jerusalem. And so that going up, Aliyah was born. And so Jewish people from around the world would bring their money and place it on their kitchen table and in a little offering box, and they would put their pesos or their pennies or whatever. And when that box was filled, they would send it off to a centralized location. And when there was enough money to purchase some land, then the land would be purchased from absentee Arab landowners that lived in Damascus. And they would sell it at figuring, hey, I'm going to get rid of this land. Most of it was not good land. It was swamp and mosquito-infested land. And they would sell it to the Jewish people at inflated prices. But the Jewish people would learn through sacrifice and from bringing their knowledge of working the land in their homeland of Russia. And they would come and they would drain those swamps and they would coax life out of the land. And soon they brought that land back to life. And also into great productivity, by the way. There was a second wave or a second Aliyah, and that lasted from 1904 to the outbreak of World War I in 1914. So prior to the establishment of the nation of Israel, there would be 5 major waves of Jewish immigration. And it's interesting, as you study it, you'll see that each one of them was precipitated by an increase of persecution against the Jewish people. And so it would cause them to realize once again, there is no safety in the land that they were living ultimately. There were approximately 35,000 Russian Jews who made Aliyah between 1882 and 1903. And the second Aliyah brought about 40,000 from Russia, and this time also from Poland, to the land. So the land began to prosper, and it would become a land once again that could sustain life and could sustain the people. So that vision of returning back was born. And during the same time, there were events occurred that would awaken, not just in a couple of nations, but worldwide. It would awaken a worldwide uniting of forces of the Jews toward their homeland. And the catalyst for this worldwide movement was a reporter from a Viennese newspaper, Theodor Herzl, who had actually been sent to cover a story in Paris. He came to write about the story, about the trial, and it was a trial of a French army captain, Alfred Dreyfus, who had lived in France. His family had for generations. He was not a religious Jew. He was a secular Jew, and he had served in the military. And he was being falsely accused of treason. He was accused for working as a spy for the Ottoman Turks. And so Herzl had been sent by the newspaper to report on this story. And it was there in Paris that Herzl saw firsthand the ugliness of anti-Semitism. What he saw was during the day and at night, the people of Paris were taking to the streets, and they were shouting, "Hang the Jew." You see, it didn't matter that Alfred Dreyfus was a patriotic French soldier. He was suddenly reduced to just being a Jew. And it was that experience that brought a clear revelation to Herzl. And what he saw was that ultimately there would never be a safe place for Jews when problems would occur, when there would be people that were angry with the government. It easily could be reflected as onto the Jews. And so Herzl was forever changed. He realized that the Jewish people needed their own homeland where they could be saved from persecution and anti-Semitism. He would go on to write a pamphlet called Der Judenstaat, which is translated to the Jewish state. And it was a work that presents a vision for the establishment of a Jewish homeland. And he began the Zionist movement. The first Zionist conference was actually held in 1897 in Basel, Switzerland. And it would be at that time that the economic foundation for the modern state of Israel would be established. And I had the privilege one time when I was traveling and speaking, and I was speaking in Basel, Switzerland, and I went to that building where Theodor Herzl, where he has that famous picture of him looking out and having a revelation that he would write in his diary. And this is what he wrote. At the conclusion of that conference, he said, "Within 50 years, there will be a Jewish homeland." Now, Herzl never lived to see that happen, but as he wrote, and it was a prophetic vision, that 50 years later, indeed, in 1947, the UN Resolution 181 voted to establish a Jewish state and an Arab Palestinian state. Captain Dreyfus was sentenced to life imprisonment, and he was sentenced to live out that sentence, life sentence, on Devil's Island. But thankfully, he was later exonerated in 1906. He was given back his commission, and he lived out his life in France, ever grateful to have been exonerated and proved that he was, in fact, a very patriotic Jewish soldier in France. So God used the anti-Semitism that was in Russia and in France at that time to actually set the stage for the reestablishing of the ancient Jewish homeland, Israel. So the third strand of, I call this incredible cord of events, occurred in 1883. And I love this story. Eliezer ben Yehuda was a Jewish man, and he left Marseille, France, and he came to Palestine to revive the ancient Hebrew language to modern life. You see, with the destruction of the Second Temple and the dispersion of the Jews to the uttermost parts of the earth, to many nations during the exile, the Hebrew language as the common spoken language of the people really fell out of use. And it just stands to reason during the dispersion, people would begin to learn and speak the language of the nation or the people in which they lived. So Hebrew then became primarily the language of religious rituals, liturgy, and the written texts. And as one author wrote about the language at that time, he said this: "It isn't that most people couldn't speak the ancient language, It's just that they never did. Then in the 1870s, Eliezer Perlman, a Lithuanian Jew, became convinced that to achieve the kind of unity that would be needed to establish and reestablish and build a Jewish national homeland, he realized that a revival of Hebrew was essential. He would dedicate his life to that revival and the transformation of the language of the ancient texts to one that could become a modern language and a modern written language that all Jews could use. I mean, he was an incredible visionary, and he was absolutely right. And it would be essential in rebuilding their ancient homeland. So Lithuanian Eliezer Yitzhak Perlman changed his name to Eliezer ben Yehuda, and he left Lithuania and he traveled to Jaffa via Vienna. And it was there in Vienna that his childhood friend, Devorah, and he married. And so she joined him on that pilgrimage back to the Holy Land. And it was on that voyage that they agreed that they would only speak Hebrew. And I mean, what a challenge to speak an ancient language and to try to have a language that somehow would be able to express modern terms. But they were committed. And it was actually on that trip that she became pregnant. And in 1892, their first child was born. And they had made that commitment that their child would only speak Hebrew. And so that was the rule that they made together. That's the only language that their child would hear, and it would become his mother tongue. And they named their son Ben Zion, and it means son of Zion. And he became the first native speaker of Hebrew in modern times. What a great story. For the next 50 years, Eliezer ben Yehuda would work to create the first Hebrew dictionary. It was a 50-year dedication, and it would include not only biblical words, but new modern words that he would create. And to create those words, he drew on ancient texts, on other Semitic languages, particularly Aramaic, and he would create new words. The first, I think it's interesting, the first Hebrew word, modern Hebrew word that he created was the word milon, which means dictionary. That's a pretty smart thing to do. So it was the beginning of thousands of words that he would add. And he had other linguists working with him, but he was the driving force. And they would create words like bacteria, bicycle, omelet, jelly, towel. Some believe that in this process, as the modern Hebrew language was created, some view it as in response to Zephaniah 3:9, and they say, "Oh, this is in prophetic to Zechariah 3:9 that says, 'For then I will restore to the peoples a pure language, that they may all call upon the Lord.'" Fascinating. When God made an irrevocable, everlasting covenant with Abraham and his descendants, the Jews, for the land and for the people in Genesis 12, and then reaffirmed it again in chapter 15, he will be faithful to fulfill it. I want to read particularly in a scripture that I think really encapsulates this. It's Amos 9, verses 14 and 15. "I will bring my exiled people of Israel back from distant lands, and they will rebuild their ruined cities and live in them again. They will plant vineyards and gardens. They will eat their crops and drink their wine. I will firmly plant them there in their own land. They will never again be uprooted from the land I have given them, says the Lord your God. You know, as we look back to the 140 years, we can see the hand of God at work. We can see the hand of God beginning to bring back the Jewish people to the land in that Aliyah movement. We can see him bringing a visionary, Theodor Herzl, to unite the Jewish people worldwide. And we can see him raising up a scholar and a linguist to give the people a unified language. All of it working together for the reestablishing of the modern state of Israel in 1948. A work that only a sovereign, covenant-keeping God could do. If you've enjoyed this podcast, I hope you'll join me again. And not only that, I hope that you will click like and share. Be blessed and shalom.